Let's be straight here. At some point, you are going to die. Your parents are going to die. We are all going to die. You don't know when it will happen, but you can be certain that it will. And when it does, it's not going to be great. Well, obviously, you won't care because you're dead. But for those that are left behind, it's going to be one of the hardest things that they will ever have to go through, which can be made 1,000,000 times worse if you've left your financial affairs in a mess. Now, you might be thinking, why the hell do I need to watch this? I'm not going to die anytime soon. And I hope that's true. But you probably have parents or grandparents that are getting older, which means that you might soon be on the receiving end of a financial nightmare, unless you do something about it. Which is why I want to tell you a story about a client of mine whose father died recently, and the mistakes that he made, which left my client in a very distressing situation and with a £400,000 tax bill to pay. He has asked me to share this story with you because he wants to raise awareness about this stuff so that not only you can sort out your own affairs, but start having conversations with those around you so that you don't end up in his shoes. And as we go through this, you're going to learn about what actually happens when you die and the tactics that could have been used to avoid this situation and almost eliminate that tax bill entirely. Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, my name is James. I am a financial planner and I spend a lot of time talking to my clients about death. Now, this may sound morbid, but it's not. You see, we humans tend to spend most of our lives thinking that we are immortal, death being a concept that only applies to others, which leads us not to live our lives as fully as we should be, because there's always tomorrow. But if you embrace the fact that your time on this earth is finite, life becomes a little bit brighter, and you start to make the time to do the things that are important to you whilst you still can. But I also talk about death so that my clients can avoid exactly what I'm about to show you. So for some context, I started working with this client shortly after his father had died. For privacy purposes, let's call my client Archie and his father Frank. Frank was in his early 70s and up until this point had been relatively healthy. He had got divorced from Archie's mother many years before and was now living on his own near Archie and his young family. Unfortunately, in 2020, Frank had a stroke, which left him unable to communicate or to look after himself, which, as you can imagine, was devastating for Frank, Archie, and their entire family. But on top of this, Archie was then suddenly responsible for managing his father's life. Now imagine if you suddenly dropped down where you're sitting right now and you were unable to look after yourself. Think about all of the little jobs that you do to look after yourself and keep your home running. Cleaning, cooking, paying bills, walking the dog. Someone else now has to do all of these things for you. Not only this, but Archie also had to make medical decisions for Frank and organise his finances to pay for his care and keep his phone running. But this is where they ran into their first problem. You see, most people think that if you are someone's relative, their next of kin, you automatically have the ability to make decisions on their behalf. But you don't. There is no legal basis for this, even if you are married. If, for an example, a doctor wanted to carry out a procedure that involved risks, they would normally explain them to you so that you can decide for yourself whether you want to go ahead. But if you are unable to make that decision, then the doctor will make that decision for you, based on what they think is best. Yes, they will consult your family, but they are not legally obliged to follow their requests. And financially, Archie knew that his dad had the money to pay for his own care, but Archie did not have access to any of his bank accounts, which left Archie to have to pay for everything himself until he could get a court order to grant him access to his father's accounts. Imagine this for a second. Your father has just had a stroke that he is not likely to recover from. You are trying to process all of this and grieve, support your own family in their grief, whilst also having to manage his household, battle with doctors, and go through a court process to get access to his finances. This is really heavy. but it could have been avoided. If Frank had set up a lasting power of attorney, he could have given Archie the right to make medical decisions for him and manage his finances on his behalf. Unfortunately, people only start to think about powers of attorney when someone has already started to lose their mental capacity, which by then it's too late. But this stuff can happen to anyone. Think about Michael Schumacher and his skiing accident. Powers of attorney is something that we should all have in place, and you can set this stuff up cheaply online in 15 minutes. So I've left some links down in the description so that you can get this done today. Honestly, if there is only one thing that you do today, make it be this. So Archie did eventually get access to Frank's bank accounts, but unfortunately, Frank did not recover from his stroke and died a short while afterwards, which then left Archie in another difficult position, as he then had to sort out Frank's estate. But Frank had died without a valid will. Having a valid, up-to-date will is important for many reasons. Firstly, it should name an executor who you trust to be responsible for collating the value of your estate, paying any inheritance tax, and then distributing that estate to beneficiaries. Secondly, it should provide a detailed list of your assets so that that executor can then easily track them down. And thirdly, it will enable you to choose who your assets should be left to. But Frank died without any of this, which meant that Archie had to firstly put himself forwards to administer the estate, then try and track down all of Frank's assets for which he had no guide, then try and access each of these accounts so that he can value the estate, organise for any inheritance tax to be paid, and apply for powers of administration over the estate, which can then take much longer if you do not have a will. And at the end of it, because there is no will, the state then decides who gets what. Not only this, but it all has to be done within a strict time frame, because you only have 6 months from the date of death to collate the entire estate, value it, and pay any IHT. Otherwise, you start to get penalties. And if Archie makes any mistakes, so if he misses some random stock holding that Frank has held for decades, Archie then becomes personally liable for any underpaid tax. This is why it is so important that you not only have a valid will that is up to date, but you also keep a file that details each of your assets, where they are held, contact numbers, account numbers, and perhaps even passwords that can then help your family with this process. This will be one of the most painful moments in your family's life, and I cannot tell you how much it helps to have this sorted beforehand. My own grandfather also died in his early 70s, but not only had he kept a file with all of these records, but he'd already selected a solicitor to help us manage the estate, and even gone so far as to plan his own funeral, picking the hymns that he wanted sung and the wine that he wanted served at the wake, so that my mother and grandmother did not have to worry about this and could just focus on grieving. This is something that we will all have to deal with at some point in our lives, and I imagine that many of you will have already been through this. So if you do have your own story to share, or perhaps things that you've learned along the way, I would be really grateful if you could leave a comment down below about your experiences so that the rest of us can all learn from your example. So Archie set out on this task of tracking down all of Frank's assets, which involved getting in touch with every single financial institution that he had a relationship with, of which there were 25 in total, informing them of his death, getting access to the accounts so that he could then value the estate. And when he finally got it all together, this is what it looked like. Frank's home was valued at £600,000. He had 2 buy-to-let properties with a total value of £400,000, but he had £150,000 of mortgages outstanding on those. He had several personal pensions with a total value of £250,000. ISAs of £300,000, again split across multiple different providers, £150,000 of various direct equity investments, cash of £130,000, and then personal possessions valued at £70,000. So in total, his estate was worth £1.75 million. And to work out the inheritance tax due, we first need to subtract away his private pensions because they fall outside of his estate. We all then have a nil rate band of £325,000 upon which no IHT is payable. And now there is also a residence nil rate band of £175,000 per person that can be used against your primary residence, which leaves Frank with a taxable estate of £1 million. IHT is then charged at 40%, giving a total tax bill of £400,000, which is a eye-watering amount of money. What's worse is that technically you are not allowed to sell any of these assets to help pay that tax bill. When I first heard this, I was like, what? Surely that can't be right. How the hell is anybody supposed to pay this bill without selling down any assets? Well, yes, you can use any cash that is already within the estate, but you need to get the rest from somewhere else, which meant that Archie needed to find £270,000 of cash from his own pocket. But given that pensions fall outside of your estate, they are often passed on to beneficiaries quite quickly and can be used to pay an IHT bill. And given that Frank had died before 75, Archie could take money out of this pension as a tax-free lump sum to help pay for this bill, which is what he was planning to do until I advised him not to. You see, if someone dies before 75 and you inherit their pension, it essentially becomes like an ISA. You can keep the money within the tax wrapper, it continues to grow free of income and capital gains tax, and you don't have to pay income tax when you take money out of it. But if you do take money out, you can't put it back in again, and you lose all of those tax benefits. And given that Archie is about to inherit a significant amount of money that then he needs to get into tax wrappers, preserving this would be very beneficial. So instead, I suggested that he get a short-term loan from a bank secured against the value of the estate and use that to pay the IHT bill. Once paid, Archie could sell down Frank's stocks and shares to quickly repay the loan and keep interest costs to a minimum. So finally, Archie has now paid the IHT bill and repaid the loan, and all that's left now is to distribute the estate. But because Frank died without a valid will, he gets no say in how it is divided. Instead, it's divided by the laws of intestacy, which grants the first £270,000 to any surviving spouse and splits the rest 50-50 between the spouse and any children. Fortunately, in this case, there was no surviving spouse, so the estate was split evenly between Archie and his sister. But can you imagine the difficulties that this could have caused if Frank was still married, or if he had remarried and his assets were then arbitrarily divided between them and his children? This is why it is so important that you make sure that you have a will that is valid, that is up to date and easy for your family to find in the event of your death. There is no excuse for not having this. So again, I have left a few links down in the description to sites where you can do this cheaply online. So after Frank's estate was finally settled, Archie and his sister were each left with £675,000, whilst the taxman got £400,000, which is still a soul-destroying amount of money to have to say goodbye to. Obviously, there is nothing that Archie or Frank can do about this now, but if they had been organised, there are lots of ways that this could have been avoided. Firstly, if Frank had written a will and left 10% of his estate to charity, not only would this have reduced the taxable value of his estate, but it would also likely qualify for a lower rate of IHT at 36%, resulting in £150,000 going to charity, £37,000 less inheritance for each of his children, but most importantly, £76,000 less in tax. Secondly, when Frank retired, he decided to take the 25% tax-free cash lump sum from his pension to buy a buy-to-let property. And since then, he'd been drawing down on the rest of his pension for income. Most people think this is a sensible thing to do, even if it's just to make use of your personal income tax allowances. But even then, it's often a mistake. Instead, he should have tried to keep as much money as he could within the pension and prioritize drawing down from other investments that fall inside of his estate. And as a result, he could have ended up with another £250,000 in his pension at this point, further reducing his IHT bill by £80,000. What's more is that even if you're retired, you can still contribute £3,600 into a pension each year, which includes the 20% tax relief. And if Frank had been doing this since he retired, he could have had an extra £60,000 in his pension, again, further reducing his tax bill. This is the thing with inheritance tax. If you are organised, it is an entirely optional tax. And the most effective way to avoid it is either by just spending the money or giving it away. Now, obviously, the big challenge here is that we have no idea when we might die and how much money we might need to sustain ourselves until we do, which is why cash flow planning and modeling your retirement spend is so important. On one hand, it can help you feel more confident to spend more money in those early years of retirement, and on the other, it can help you establish how much you can afford to give to your children and grandchildren without the risk of it affecting your own quality of life. And this was definitely the case with Frank, because to test this, I put his situation into a cash flow model and discovered that he could have afforded to give away £400,000 with there being very little risk of him ever running out of money, even if he lived to 100. Of course, his life was cut short, but if he had known this before he died, he could have started giving away his assets earlier, when it would have made more impact to his family and he would have been alive to see them enjoy it. If Frank then survived for 7 years after making these gifts, they would become completely free of IHT. But if Frank didn't think that he would live that long, there are special types of investments that can help you get money out of your estate in just 2 years rather than 7. And if Frank had been able to do this, it would have reduced his tax bill by a further £160,000. Now, even if you can afford to make gifts like this, many people are reticent to do so because they're concerned that their grown children might get divorced or their grandchildren might spend it unwisely. But this is where things like trusts and family investment companies come in, vehicles that enable you to retain control of your assets and what they're used for whilst giving up the right to them. I could spend many hours talking about the myriad different ways that you could minimize tax, but I appreciate that this is getting pretty niche and might not be of interest to a large part of my audience, which is why I have decided to set up a newsletter where I'll be doing deep dives into more niche technical areas like this. So if you want to learn more about this type of stuff, I have left a link down in the description to where you can subscribe. This example of Frank and Archie has only scratched the surface of the complexities involved with death, but I hope that their story will motivate you to look into this stuff further, to set up wills and powers of attorney, and most importantly, start discussing these things with your family so that you can avoid finding yourself in Archie's shoes.